Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're going to be talking about clones for the M16A2. The last couple of videos I did got a lot of good interest, and I had a couple people that asked me about doing a similar one for M16A2 builds. The M16A2 is, by today's standards, is considered outdated because of the fact that it has the traditional iron sights. So they're not as popular, obviously, as the flat tops are. But for those of us who carried these things while in the service, they're definitely very relevant. When I went to basic training at Fort Benning in 1991, my unit at Sand Hill at Fort Benning, we were the first unit to actually train on the M16A2s in basic training. We were the first cycle to go through there that actually had them. Which is sort of funny because right after we qualified BRM, they took them away from us, gave us the old M16A1s, and then these went to the next cycle that was going through. So this was actually the one that I carried. Now, for as far as M16A2 clones and variants, most of the manufacturers who are out there, well, not the bigger ones, but I'm sure you can go to like Bushmaster, you can go to probably DPMS and Rock River and all those guys, and they will have a rifle that's basically, an M16A2. I'm going to talk a little bit about the M16A2 and some of the changes on it, and just a little bit about where they come from. Not really too much because this is really on clones, but it sort of will help you when you're selecting your components to build one. Now, the first rifle that I have here is actually all Colt. I had built this one after I got out of the Army in the early 1990s because I wanted something that was exactly what I carried, and I wanted an actual Colt. At the time, I had a Bushmaster A2, which was, it was no different than what I carried, but it had a snake on it instead of a horse. And I obviously wanted a horse because that's what I had. So I had built this one because Colt never really made. Short of the AR-15A2 government model, well, they had the AR-15A2 H bars that were all the pre-assault weapon ban, and then but those all had the original AR-15 Sporter series lower receivers that had there was no magazine well boss on it. It was they had the screws in the front instead of the push pins, and it was still the AR-15. It wasn't actually the M16A2 type lower receiver. And then comes the just before the assault weapon ban with the Colt Sporter series. And the Colt Sporter series had a couple of variants where they actually used the M16A2 lower receiver types, but the first model had two a screw and a collet. The next one it was actually a standard front pivot pin, but instead of it having the track on it and having the detent and spring put in it, it actually had a screw, the one on the left hand side. And then they finally went to the actual push pin, which they use today. So this one here was actually sort of a hybrid between all of them that we're going to talk about. But I want to talk a little bit about the A2, some of the actual products that you're going to be looking for. Taking a look at the stock, we have the actual A2 stock, which is 5/8 of an inch longer. It's also manufactured from a different material than the original Fiberite. This is actually a foam-filled nylon. The butt plate, you will notice, is a little different also. You actually have a full texture on the butt plate itself, plus the trapdoor itself, rather than the original A1s that was made out of a much weaker material. There was no structure or no texture on the outside at all. You just had the trapdoor. The forward assist is rather interesting because there's actually a few different types of forward assist. The original A2s that first came out in the late 80s had this type, which you had a circle and you had to make it larger. Then you had a notch cut in the side. This was the original one, and then it had switched to the current one you see today, which actually is just a round button. But this is actually the original one. When we talk about the differences between the A1 and the A2 lower receivers, there's two major areas that we look at. First is this area back here. This is actually much more reinforced to make stronger than the actual A1. And the front here also, you notice how this goes up on an angle rather than just straight over. This was actually reinforced also. Those are the two main features to talk about an A2 lower receiver. Now, the one thing this is actually lacking from the military A2, at the time this lower receiver was made, you didn't have the safe and the fire on the right-hand side. The actual sights itself, this is the A2 fully adjustable rear sight. This actually is a derivative of the original Colt LMG rear sight that was made by Colt's Hank Tatro. you need to be careful when you're actually buying the components for these rear sights too, because you have two of them. You have one which has a much finer thread and is shorter, and that's one that goes in the detachable carrying handle for the M4, and it's adjustable out to 600 meters. And the one that goes on the actual A2 rifle is longer, and it has they're not nearly as fine, the threads on it, and that one goes up to 800 meters. Fully adjustable on the windage on the right hand side, 2 apertures. The upper receiver itself, this is actually a Colt upper receiver. You can see this is the original, it's the Colt gray, as opposed to the black and the jet blacks that we have now. So this is more true, to what I had in the early 90s versus what they would have had today, or for per se like on an M4 or an M16A4. We go forward a little bit. You can also see the canted delta ring instead of the straight. This was originally done on the A2 program itself. You'll see the fired cartridge case deflector on the side as well. The handguards are actually the universal upper and lower. You don't have the no longer left and right hand side. So now instead of stocking 2-part numbers, you stock 1. These are much more durable, much more strong than the original triangular handguards. Although I have to say I actually like the feel of the triangular handguards better. Now the barrel itself is interesting because underneath this handguard, the barrel is the same diameter as the A1 barrel. It had to be left that way so you could attach the M203 grenade launcher to it. But the front was actually increased in diameter due to the complaints from paratroopers. When they would land, the barrels sometimes would hit the ground on the A1s and they would actually bend. I think it's more reasonable to say that it more happened when guys were putting bayonets on these things and trying to use them to open up crates. But the external barrel was actually, the diameter was made much larger, and it was strengthened. And the flash suppressor was changed from a flash suppressor into a compensator. The flash suppressor, the original birdcage, had vents that went all the way around, which is far more efficient for flash suppression itself. But the compensator, with having the bottom left solid, was designed to compensate to keep the muzzle down, and also when you were laying in the prone position, it wouldn't blow dirt up from the ground when you were shooting. The other thing that's really unique about the barrel too was this was the first time there was the 5.56 NATO cartridge. As you may or may not know, there's 2 different types of 5.56 millimeter ammunition. You have the original 5.56 millimeter that was the Vietnam era, which was the M193, which is a 55 grain full metal jacket. The M855 is the 5.56 NATO. That is the NATO standard cartridge that was adopted by all of NATO. And that's the one with a 62 grain full metal jacket with a steel penetrator core in it, a 3-piece projectile. Now, in order to stabilize the new NATO projectile, you had to change the barrel from 1 turn in 12-inch twist of the A1 to the 1 turn in 7. This is also something that people have a lot of discussion about. The reality is, to stabilize a 62 projectile, a 1 in 9 is plenty. It's probably more ideal than the 1 in 7. The reason why they went to a 1 in 7 was due to the fact that the M856 tracer round would not stabilize under Arctic conditions. Projectiles and ammunition actually react differently in different climatic conditions. And during the actual Arctic or cold weather, it would not stabilize with a 1 in 9. So that is the reason for the 1 in 7. The 1 in 9 would have been a better option due to the fact that it actually lasts longer. It's not as fast. The barrel would have a better barrel life, but they wanted to have the compatibility with the ammunition. And the 1 in 7 would go to be used right up to today. Throughout NATO countries, everything is going to have a 1 in 7-inch twist barrel. So we're going to talk about this specific rifle. This specific rifle did not come this way. This specific rifle came as an original Colt Sporter target rifle. What that meant is what you would see here. However, Colt had voluntarily taken off the bayonet lug. Now, back then, that was not required. It was not part of any ban. It was something that Colt had voluntarily done. And if you want an actual A2, you want it to be exact. And even though you aren't really going to use a bayonet, that's something that was important to someone who was attention to details. So what I did was I replaced the upper receiver with, this is a Colt upper receiver itself. The barrel is actually a Colt M16A2 government barrel. It was one that was bought from Colt, in the early 90s. This was an actual government-run A2 barrel with the bayonet lug. And you also notice this is early because instead of seeing the crush washer on here, you see the peel washer. That was later changed to the actual crush washer itself. Standard handguards. I actually had sold the Colt Sporter upper receiver. The other thing that I had done to this rifle too was when this one came, this one didn't come with the push pin. This one actually came with the pin that over here actually had a screw that you would remove the screw, and I obviously did not care for that due to the fact that the A2 that I had actually had the two push screws. So I had taken it to a friend of mine who was a machinist, and he compared my Bushmaster lower that actually had the hole already drilled in the boss there, and he actually drilled this for me. So I was able to put in the push pin. So that was modified. Now this again is a Colt Sporter lower. This actually had Colt's infinite auto sear block, as we can see in here. This was actually put in for two reasons. One, it blocked the ability to put it in an auto sear. By having a location here, if you were to remove this, there'd be no way to locate an actual auto sear itself. And also what this did was it prevented you from being able to put a full auto bolt carrier in. But the tail of the bolt carrier would hit this, and you wouldn't be able to close the receiver. So it forced you to use an actual semi-automatic only bolt carrier. The other thing that was done to this lower receiver, which was also part of much heartache, was Colt decided they were going to voluntarily make this rifle less prone to being able to be converted. So the hammer and trigger pins were changed. The original hammer and trigger pins were a .155 diameter, the mil-spec ones. They increased this diameter to 0.170 instead of 1.55, and which obviously meant they increased the hammer and trigger pin size. They had to increase the hole in the hammer and trigger pin and disconnector. So it made it so you could not put in any of the commercial or the mil-spec type trigger enhancements. I'm not necessarily talking about automatic components. But what I'm talking about is any of the upgraded triggers. So Colt had its own flavor here. If you were to buy a Colt, you had to have all proprietary components. There were some of the companies like Geisley who actually made triggers that were .170, but most companies did not. This was something that Colt would not abandon until probably around 2009 with the commercial and the LE guns. 2009, 2010, Colt finally heard enough from the customers saying that they didn't want this 170 diameter bullshit. They wanted it to be mil-spec so they could actually use all the components. So it was around 2009, 2010 time period where Colt actually switched back to that. So, in the end, I did get what I wanted. I wanted a Colt A2, which had every detail. This rifle here back in the day was probably around $1,100. It was bought right before the 1994 Black Day with the assault weapon ban. So it came in right before that. But if you want to do the same thing today, Colt does not offer anything like this today. They don't offer any kind of a long rifle. So I decided I did want to build another one, and the one that I built was actually off of Aero Precision. Aero Precision today offers all of the components that you would need for an A2 build. However, the upper receiver was a problem. The upper receiver actually I got was a Colt receiver. Now, Colt has not made a receiver that did not have M4 feed ramps for many, many, many years. So when I got this receiver, it actually had the M4 feed ramps in it. So I had to do a little bit of gunsmithing to it. The barrel you see on here also is a Colt M16A2 barrel. It's all Colt production. The handguards as well. But the barrel had a rifle receiver extension that does not have the M4 feed ramps. So basically with a Dremel tool, I went in there and just rounded off the edges on the barrel extension to match the feed ramps on the upper receiver. So basically now I have feed ramps on the upper receiver as well as the barrel extension. And that is considered an enhancement. There are absolutely no negatives to it. It's only positives. It's not necessarily what I would say is exact to the concept of the A2, but it was something that's not seen. Stock assembly is the exact same. This, again, I found one of the early Colt receivers for. The low receiver actually does have the notch on here, but instead of it saying safe and fire, it has the pictograms. A2 grip on it. You go on the side, it just says Aero Precision. But this rifle here too is pretty much exactly a A2. And again, all these components, the lower receiver was completely manufactured by Aero Precision. The trigger group was, it all came with it. The only thing that I had modified was just the upper receiver. The whole lower half is you can buy directly from Aero Precision. The upper receiver, again, you can go on anywhere. Armalite sells them. You know, Rock River, Bushmaster. You can find A2 upper receivers pretty much anywhere. And occasionally you can run into some A2 parts kits. But this is definitely not a difficult rifle to duplicate. It's just they don't seem to just be as popular any longer because of the fact that they don't accept the flat top upper receivers. It's a it's a fixed carrying handle. Now the A2 still have the hole in the top of the carrying handle where you can use the, for instance, the arms mount to mount an optic. And of course, if you were to compare, an M16A2 to an M16A4 with mounting optics, you're adding a couple inches up here that you're increasing the height of the optic. So, I mean, if you're going to put an optic on it, this is just not the way to go. You want to go with a flat top because you don't want to have your head sticking up so high; it's a little uncomfortable on your neck. But if you wanted to go old school, you wanted to go with your iron sights, really good iron sights. You want a traditional A2. There are several ways to go about it. Again, the Colt's a little more difficult to do because you got to find some of those older rifles to work with. Some of the more current ones, they would say M4 on them or Sport or whatever. And as long as you didn't care about what they said, you probably could still today build them off of a Colt receiver if you so chose. You would just have to get a good black receiver that matches the color. Now, I do want to say something about color as well, because a lot of people will complain when they see rifles come through where you have unmatching upper and lower receivers. And I want to explain a little bit of that. Now, when we hear the term mil spec, what mil spec means is what the military standards are. For as far as receiver colors, there's actually a color scale which goes from charcoal gray to jet black. As long as the receiver, being an upper or lower receiver, fit within that color scheme, it's acceptable for U.S. military use, which means you could have a jet black upper receiver and a charcoal gray lower receiver is within the military specifications, and they will accept it. Now, for the commercial market, they figure if they're going to be spending $1,000 for a rifle, they want those to actually match. So if you want that, it can become difficult sometimes because there's a lot of factors that go into the color of an anodized receiver, such as the actual dye that's used, who's manufacturing it, even the same manufacturers. For instance, Colt would use Light Metals in Connecticut. Now, Light Metals does a whole series of different kinds of colors. If you want to get the matte finish on it, a matte or a non-reflective, you got to make sure it's bead blasted properly. If you leave that without bead blasting it, you're going to get that shinier, that glossier type. So for the commercial or for the LE who care a lot more about aesthetics, it takes a little bit more research on your part to find parts that actually match. If you were to go back in time here and look at some of the M16A1s that were sold through Class 3 dealers, the pre-86 ones, most of the time, if you were to look at the upper and lower receivers, they're not going to match. You'll see ones that have really, really light charcoal gray lower receivers with ones that have sort of a charcoal black instead of a charcoal gray upper receiver. Again, these were designed as tools, not as a Perazzi shotgun where you're going to make sure everything is exactly perfect. So if you can understand that these are tools and you're not going to have those kinds of perfections, you're good to go. But if you're somebody who really wants aesthetics, you want everything perfect, there's few manufacturers that really offer those exact matching upper and lowers. You do see it, but a lot of the manufacturers will not. They will have slight variance. But that's really in a short presentation what the A2 is. Again, very easy to come across. You can build them very easily. If you're as picky as I am, it takes a little bit more research and a little bit more effort, because again, you can see this is a A2 that was built in 2014. This is one that was done in 1992, 93. You can clearly see the differences in the receiver finishes and all the parts that go along with that. The M16A2 is truly a transitional rifle for the U.S. military. It was bringing it in from the Vietnam era to the NATO era, and it would serve for very many years with distinction in all branches of the military. This really was the design of the Marine Corps. Even though the NATO was going to be military-wide, the Marines actually were the ones that took the lead in development. And the rear sight was all Marine Corps, this fully adjustable rear sight. The interesting thing is this is about $80 to manufacture the full sight system. And the Marine Corps were the only branch of the service that ever actually learned how to use it. In the Army, I never learned how to use all the adjustments on here. We did the BZ, the Battle Sight Zero, and that was it. So as far as the Army and the Air Force and the Navy were concerned, we could have stuck with the A1 rear sight like Canadians did with the C7. The C7 to this day I still think was a better choice than the A2 rifle that we chose. The C7 Canadian rifle kept the full auto instead of and got, there was no burst on it like that we were inflicted by. And they had the standard A1 rear sight, which was more practical. And of course, this rifle would lead right into the adoption of the M16A4 after the adoption of the M4. But it's definitely a piece of U.S. military history. It saw combat in Gulf War I extensively, Operation Just Cause in Panama, and as well as just any service member who served during that time period. And these are still in use today. You can still go in Air Force bases and see these in use. You can still see some training units, some units that are colonists or here in the United States that may have these, who haven't received the M4 or A4s yet. But as of this time, the M4 is replacing every M16A2, A4 in the inventory in the U.S. military. M4s have completely taken over. The last strong holdout for the full-length rifle is the Marine Corps. They had held on to the A4 and resisted the M4. However, now they have adopted the M4 carbines, and I would expect to see them be decommissioning their M4s, their M16A4s, and going to the M4 until the new M16 or M4A4 comes out, or M4A5. There's some new programs that are going on right now that are actually supposed to replace the entire M16 M4 family, and I believe that's either the M16A4 or the A5. There's two different models that are floating around. The actual criteria of that is still being discussed at the moment. They are doing a request for quote. There's a requirement for a short barrel 10.5 inch as well as a 14.5 inch. And the operating system is up in the air at the moment. And what exactly the compatibility will be between the M16 series and M4 series, and that is really yet to know. We thank you for watching the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave me a comment and I'll try and get back to you. And please subscribe. Thank you.